Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. Ukraine has received the cluster munitions from US and have been using them for a while, and last week the first reports have started appearing about their effectiveness and what they're achieving. Or instead of cluster munitions, I should probably say that this is DPICM, so dual purpose improved conventional munition. But let's, for the sake of it, just go with the cluster munition just because I don't want to bother. And it was effective. Cluster munitions have shown to be really effective against the Russian forces. Obviously, when we're thinking cluster munitions, right, we all know what it is. It's a shell or a missile that flies and then it scatters around many smaller bomblets that explode in a large area. So by just description, you already can see where the main advantage lies. So when the ammunition explodes, if there is in a large area some troops, then potentially they can get injured, and this creates a lot of casualties for non-armored targets, such as people that are probably not within trenches. Why is it working against Russians? Because we do know that Russians have trenches, right? But Russians also have a lot of manpower, and that manpower very often is on the move. So while maybe shelling trenches with cluster munition is not ideal, catching people in march is very effective. So that's why Ukraine has been using in the last week these cluster munitions to strike targets on the move. So whenever there is a column of people that are walking around, especially we've seen certain night vision or late evening videos. So apparently Russians were trying to relocate a certain number of troops during night, and then they get a cluster munition struck. And the big difference between a normal artillery shell and a cluster shell is the amount of damage that can be done on the first strike. Very often, an artillery shell that will land, it will land not very correctly, because usually artillery needs a little bit of time to adjust the precise positioning where they want to hit. And for cluster munition, the first impact casualty and precision to the target is a lot higher, just because the area that it covers is larger. So when we imagine a situation like a column, a big group of Russian troops are just moving along the road or whatever, and they are just being struck with the first artillery shell, the initial reaction will be just to scatter and find any kind of defensive position, like nearby trenches or any kind of defensive objective. If the first shell that comes in is a cluster shell, then the damage will be significant. A lot more troops potentially can be hit, and a lot more areas can be covered. So while maybe later on, when the Russian troops will find cover, it will not be as effective, the general purpose strike of this, a first impact casualty numbers is increasing, which is great news for Ukrainians, because Russians are moving a lot on foot. We see a lot of these on-foot attacks by Russians, and cluster munitions are great for defensive operations. So when, for example, last winter, when Russia was using a lot of their meat wave attacks, then cluster munitions would be invaluable invaluable, I don't know. They would be really important for Ukrainians. So it's a pity that they are delivered only now. And second most important thing is that cluster munitions have actually shown themselves to be extremely effective against Russian armor. And by Russian armor, I don't mean a lot of modern maybe vehicles or tanks or anything, but majority of Russian armor that is being used right now, especially if we're talking about transport or whatnot, is either the MTLB, which is an old Soviet, old multi-purpose vehicle. It's not very lightly armored. It's basically a tractor with some metal plates on it. Let's put it this way. And then the second one is BMPs, the infantry fighting vehicles, but the older versions, like BMP-1 or maybe BMP-2 sometimes. And all of them are older Soviet type of vehicles. And these vehicles, they don't have a lot of modern equipment, modern armor. They're just old, essentially from the shelf, from the Russian storages. And these cluster munitions have proven themselves effective in penetrating these vehicles. So that means that we've seen many, many times when like a vehicle just drives somewhere along the forest, and then artillery strike lands and it's like a little bit further away, like 5-6 meters. And then the vehicle just like, oh no, time to go to drive away. So they just kind of scatter up and just go after like maybe second or third shell maximum has landed in a specific area. So it's very hard to hit like this kind of mobiles. With the cluster munitions, it's proving themselves to be very, very efficient in doing so. So Ukrainians are reporting that if we're talking in offensive operations, for example, when Russians are not attacking, which we're going to talk to, but when Russians are stationary and there is just some kind of support vehicle that's coming to assist them, then striking the area around that support vehicle with cluster munitions has proven themselves to be very, very efficient. And now we also get reports that cluster munitions are also made its way to the southern axis around Zaporizhia. And here we talk about the Russian style defense operations. Now, Russians are not just sitting in the trenches and waiting for Ukrainians to attack, because to be honest, Ukrainians have gotten quite good in clearing trenches. What Russia instead is utilizing is their manpower advantage, the fact that they just have a lot of manpower that they can throw around. And I know a lot of analysts are saying that they shouldn't do it because it's reserves, but this is how they're used to fighting. And a lot of the Russian doctrine is centered around counterattacking. And these counterattacks, as you could expect, so once Ukrainian units take some certain positions, then the Russians are trying to push them out, and they're sending a lot of counterattacks, and they're trying to delay any kind of advances by Ukrainians. So as I explained just above, cluster munitions are excellent when the forces that are attacking you are very, very light, because majority of Russian counterattacks are happening inside of the same MTLB or infantry fighting vehicle from the Soviet times, which is super effective. So what we're getting from this, we're getting that cluster munition may be not a game changer weapon, but it's a lot more efficient than it was expected. And the best part is that there is a lot of them. Like US have stockpiled a lot of cluster munitions, and cluster munitions are proven to be extremely, extremely useful right now for Ukraine. So while the ramping up of the process of producing new artillery shells like traditionals 155 is ramping up, it's also great to hear that Ukraine will get a lot of additional, just generally shells, cluster or non-cluster, to fire at Russians, and especially if they're so efficient. Thank you so much for watching this, guys. I love you all. Support me and buy me a coffee. Join Discord. Write a comment. Tell me what you think about this. Do you think it's controversial? Let me know. Love you all. Slava Ukraini. I'll see you next time.